A federal operation, a tragic death, and a city just completely on edge. In only 24 hours, a crisis in Minnesota exploded into a national flashpoint. It pitted federal agents against local officials, and it started to split a political party right down the middle. So let's get into it and unpack exactly how Operation Metro Surge went down.
Just think about that for a second. This is a Republican candidate for governor saying this. It really gets to the very heart of the crisis that just erupted in Minnesota. So how on earth did we get to a point where American citizens felt like they had to carry their papers on American soil? Well, let's trace it all back to the beginning.
All right, so this whole thing was kicked off by a single tragic event. And what's really key is how the administration immediately jumped on it to frame a very specific narrative.
Right after the killing of a VA intensive care nurse named Alex Preddy, the administration's message was crystal clear. This was not about the conduct of federal agents. No, this was about, quote, the failure of local Democratic officials to cooperate. And that right there set the stage for a massive federal escalation. Now, you really have to pay close attention to the specific words being used here. Supporters like former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, they didn't just condemn the violence. They went a step further, calling protesters a violent domestic terrorist mob. That kind of rhetoric deliberately echoes a very, very powerful piece of federal law.
And here it is, the Insurrection Act. This is a big deal. This law basically gives the president the power to use the military on U.S. soil against U.S. citizens. So, by using language straight out of this act, they were signaling a potential and really dramatic escalation of federal power. It raised the stakes through the roof.
Okay, so with that narrative set, the administration moved to put its own people on the ground to manage the whole thing. And they started with let's say, a pretty controversial pick to lead the effort.
The man they tapped for the job was Tom Homan, a White House advisor. He was sent to Minnesota to be the face of the federal response and, supposedly to de-escalate everything. The problem was, Homan's appointment came with its own set of issues.
So here's the thing you have to understand. Homan wasn't some neutral figure. He was already under a microscope for some pretty serious allegations. And behind the scenes, he was apparently clashing with a more extreme wing of the administration. He believed their focus on creating made-for-TV violence was actually doing long-term damage to agencies like ICE and Border Patrol.
And, well, this blunt take from journalist Aaron Rupar really captures the skepticism out there. I mean, sending a controversial guy nicknamed Cavabag Homan because of those allegations to handle a super delicate crisis, a lot of people saw that as a really, really flawed move.
Now, these aggressive federal tactics didn't just get a response from political opponents. It actually triggered a huge and growing backlash from inside the president's own party.
And here we are, back to Chris Medell. This wasn't just some angry statement he put out. This was him dropping out of the governor's race. He straight up called the operation retribution on the citizens and walked away from his own party because of it. That was a major, major crack in the Republican front.
This slide just illustrates the two sides of the Republican concern perfectly. On one side, you have this really real human fear. A GOP strategist, Preya Singh-Sundar, said her own legally immigrated mother was now carrying her passport just in case. And on the other side, the cold, hard political calculation from a House Republican worrying about how bad this would look in an election year.
In this dissent, it wasn't just quiet whispers in the hallways. I mean, look at this list. You've got former Vice President Mike Pence calling the images deeply troubling, and he was joined by this growing chorus of big-name Republican senators, all of them breaking ranks to demand investigations and some accountability.
And those calls for action, they quickly turned into official action. Senator Rand Paul, who's your Republican committee chair, scheduled a formal hearing and summoned the heads of the very agencies that were at the center of this whole operation. The pressure was now coming from inside Congress.
This might be the most surprising part. Even super staunch allies like Texas Governor Greg Abbott were publicly telling the White House to recalibrate. When a key supporter is telling you to find a different direction, your strategy is in deep trouble.
So the political backlash was one huge problem. But there was another, maybe even more damaging problem brewing: dissent from the actual federal agents who were tasked with carrying out the mission.
So reports started to leak out from immigration officers on the ground, and the picture they were painting was one of anger, frustration, and just collapsing morale. These were the people on the front lines, and let me tell you, they were not happy. And their list of complaints was long.
They felt like they were being used for aggressive political tactics, being put in danger, and buried under these impossible arrest quotas. They were taking all the heat from the public. And, really critically, many of them didn't agree with the administration's move to blame Alex Preddy for his own death.
This quote is just, wow, it's incredibly powerful. It shows a complete and total breakdown of trust between the agents on the street and their own leadership. When a career officer says he literally doesn't believe any of the official statements anymore, that points to a really deep crisis.
So with pressure just hammering them from all sides, from politicians and from inside its own agencies, the administration seemed to slam on the brakes and abruptly change course.
The very first sign of this pivot was the hunt for a scapegoat. A news outlet that's usually very friendly to the administration suddenly published a scathing editorial just hammering the DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, basically blaming her for tactics that were scaring away voters. You could see the political escape hatches being prepped.
And then things started happening really, really fast. First, agents and their commander start pulling out of the city. Then, just hours later, that same commander gets his social media access cut off. And finally, the president's social media starts posting these weirdly friendly summaries of phone calls with the same Democratic leaders he had been attacking just days before. It was a messy, but very clear attempt to de-escalate.
And this final comparison just says it all, doesn't it? The president's account claims lots of progress is being made. But Mayor Frey's statement? It's totally different. He says his main point was that the operation needs to end, period. You've got two completely different spins on the same phone call, each one crafted for a totally different audience.
So all of this brings us to the big, lingering question. After this whirlwind 24 hours of ramping up and then backing down, was this actually the end of the crisis in Minnesota? Or was it just a temporary ceasefire in a much bigger, ongoing fight over federal power and immigration? Well, that's something that remains to be seen.